Left at the altar. The words landed like a stone dropped into a glass of water, ripples, then a soundless collapse. Beatriz lived for rehearsals. She had walked that aisle 100 times in her head, lining up every step with a meticulous, private choreography that made panic feel like a stranger. The church smelled of lilies and wax. Her hands were steady until they weren't. The dress had been pinned and repinned until it felt right, and then, all at once, everything that was right folded inward. The bridesmaids froze as if a script had been ripped out from under them. Phones rose like small, blinking constellations. Somewhere near the back, a child began to cry, and then laughed at the confusion because his world had not yet learned shame. Her father's jaw worked like a gate. Guests whispered the kind of private, vocalized disbelief you only hear when the altar becomes a stage for someone's collapse. The message came on the large screen the wedding planner used to cue music and slides, a last-minute, bone-dry text, 3 words that weren't even a sentence. "Sorry, I can't. Raphael." The name tasted like ash in her mouth. Beatriz read it 3 times. Her chest hurt in that soft, animal way panic sometimes comes. No heat, just an urgent, cold awareness of breath. The organ continued to play because no one knew how to stop it. The priest blinked, uncertain whether to fill the silence with words. Cameras focused. This was no longer private. She could have run. 1,000 escape routes opened, out the sacristy, over the side door, into a cab, into oblivion. But there were faces, her grandmother's, impossibly pale and glued to her seat, her sister clutching the hem of her dress, colleagues who had flown in, neighbors who had been seated in the 3rd pew for the cake. There were cell phones, and with them 1,000 eyes that would turn humiliation into raw footage in minutes. Running would only add to the spectacle. He was in the pew at the back, a silhouette that looked smaller than the man she saw in the boardroom. Rodrigo Tavares had been a private presence in her life up until that moment. A crisp email, a haircut that was always exactly right, a handshake like a transaction. In the office, he was a name you prefaced with Mr. and with a certain distance women respected because it kept them safe, professionally, and perhaps a little afraid. Tonight, with the church lights haloing the wooden chairs, he looked like an echo someone had dropped into the room. He rose. The sound of him moving through the aisle made something in her tighten, not because she expected rescue, but because his movement brought an immediate recalibration of all possibilities. "Bia," he said when he reached her. Rodrigo used her name as if it were a precise instrument he could tune. He smelled like cedar and something faintly metallic, a perfume that was almost a strategy. He didn't take her hand as a lover would. He took it as if to anchor her ship. "What are you doing?"
her sister hissed, and there was fear threaded into the word. Rodrigo did not smile. He did not kneel. He stepped up beside the priest with a kind of economy of motion that made the organ feel too loud. He looked at the congregation with a composure that, if it was taught, had been rehearsed privately for decades. Then he leaned low, and the only sound was the rustle of silk. "Pretend I'm your groom," he whispered. The words were not a question. They were a proposal and a prescription at the same time. They arrived as an order disguised as mercy. Beatriz felt her face go numb. She thought of every social humiliation scene she'd seen in movies and how actors always recovered. Life did not have cutaways to commercial breaks. Her first reflex was to refuse. This was ridiculous. He was her boss. He was a man with a company that towered in glass downtown and a reputation that came with armored entrances. This was an ethical minefield. Pretending he was her groom would change the perimeter of every relationship she had at work, in her family, and with herself. It would be a lie carried into her future Instagram, her mother's dinner table. The headline of whatever local site would turn this into content by midnight. Then she saw her father's hands, calloused, small, folding and unfolding, as if the same motion could press a different outcome into being. She thought of the newspaper photos already forming in photographers' minds. She thought of the earlier toast she'd given, of work colleagues who've trusted her to mediate budgets, of a grandmother who'd worn her best hat for a celebration that was suddenly unrecognizable. She looked at Rodrigo. He offered no smile, only presence. There was an awkward honesty in that. He could have left. He could have sat down and let the moment shred her. Instead, he stepped into it. "Just for 10 minutes, he said softly. "Walk it through. We'll tell them whatever they want to hear. We'll make sure you leave with your dignity." Walking through the aisle with a stranger, as if he was the person who vowed to stay, that thought alone should have made her stomach lurch. Yet dignity is an oddly mobile thing. You can trade distance for a little of it back. She saw, as if through a windscreen, the 1,000 recordings that would otherwise be of a woman abandoned, shoulders folding inward. She thought of the children who would ask why her mother cried, and the answer she would give, the truth, or some clumsy half-truth stitched together. Her friends' faces were the last push. Julia's eyes were wide, wet with alarm. Her sister's lips pressed together, like she was holding back a flush of fury or the desire to slap something. Beatriz closed her own mouth and opened it to a single small sentence. "Okay," she breathed. It wasn't a yes to romance. It was spare and strategic.
It was a yes to a performance that would salvage the evening and maybe, in a practical way, keep her life from collapsing into an ugly, permanent phonograph. The priest, baffled, did what priests can do when scripture meets spectacle. He followed the script that still functioned. The music was swapped for something gentler. Names were rearranged. Someone produced a ring from a velvet box. Rodrigo's hand, clean and steady, offered it as if to close an old wound. Beatriz put it on because putting anything on felt safer than refusing to move. The kiss at the end of the makeshift vows was light, a businesslike punctuation. It landed differently than any kiss she had imagined under cathedral lights. It pressed a small, strange stamp on the evening. Not the promise it pretended to be, not a lie exactly either, but a shelter from spectacle. Phones swallowed the moment. A few guests clapped because clapping is what people do to signal release from tension. Someone cried loudly and then laughed, unsure if they should mourn or applaud. The reception hall would still be there in an hour, tables arranged like islands, but between the pews and the buffet there had been a tiny pivot, the difference between a tragedy and a story that might be retold with a softer edge. Outside on the church steps, cameras recorded and the videos spread. In the span between the aisle and the glass doors, an entire narrative gathered together. Bride left at altar, mysterious substitute groom, business magnate intervenes. It was slick and fast. The internet does not pause for nuance. Rodrigo walked beside her like a practiced actor guiding an understudy. He did not hold on to her in a way that would be misread. His hand was near enough to reassure. It was a promise of protocol rather than passion. When he spoke, always too low for the microphones to capture, his voice was deliberately neutral. "Stay with me," he said, "until this clears." "How long will that be?" Beatriz asked. Her voice was small and measured. She wanted to be precise with herself. She wanted to know the timetable of this improvisation and whether she would live under this lie like a borrowed coat or be forced to wear it like armor. "As long as it takes," he said, "tonight at least, for the stories, for your father." He left the rest unsaid, the part about the headlines, about shareholders and gossip, about the fact that once your private life is folded into someone else's public status, it can never entirely be private again. Part of him must have recognized that truth, because his fingers brushed the small of her back in a way that was more about guidance than intimacy. They went through the motions at the reception. Rodrigo kept his arms loose around her waist in the photographs, a professional encirclement that looked comfortable because he had practiced looking comfortable in front of lenses all his life. He was unaffected by the attention. That was his armor. When guests prodded, how did this happen? He gave them a version that cut like a scalpel and bled nothing. He told them Raphael had a sudden emergency, that the couple agreed to proceed so as not to humiliate family and friends. It was plausible. People wanted answers that didn't make them complicit in the act of cruelty, so they accepted him. Beatriz moved through that night like a person in a second-hand dress. It fit well enough, but it did not feel like her. She laughed when she was supposed to laugh. She posed when they asked. Inside, she felt a landscape of small aches, the weight of the ring, the press of a stranger's hand, the way her father's shoulders folded when he leaned into her and kissed her temple as if to repair something he could not fix. Julia stayed close, a protective pivot. She whispered comedic commentary into Beatriz's ear in the way that only the nearest person to you can, brittle with fear but soft around the edges. "You're making me furious," she hissed, and Beatriz let herself be furious, quiet and slow. At midnight, after the last of the champagne had been poured into the sink and the band had packed up their instruments, Beatriz stood under the hotel lights with her shoes in one hand and the dress tucked awkwardly under the other. The room where they had had their suite was already cleared by hotel staff who had been instructed to be discreet. Rodrigo's driver had swept in like a black bar of shadow and offered a quiet, efficient solution. He could take her to a friend's apartment. He could make sure she was not left to the street. "You don't have to come," Rodrigo said, when she looked at him across the suitcases and chairs. His voice was a low instrument in the large, suddenly intimate space. "No," she said, "I don't need pity." "It wouldn't be pity," he corrected. "It'd be logistics. A person needs armor sometimes. Tonight you have none. I can offer a coat." Beatriz thought of sleep and of her mother's house with its creaking porch and of how the neighbors' kids would point at the screen and snicker. She thought of vulnerability as a shape she could not yet carry alone. She accepted the coat, a literal black thing that smelled faintly of tobacco and citrus. They did not share a room. He left instructions with the staff to place her in a spare suite that belonged, she would learn later, to a small, quiet building registered under one of his companies for visiting executives. It was clean and anonymous. Rodrigo stayed long enough to make sure she was settled, and then he left with the same economy of motion. On the suite nightstand, the edges of the veneer reflected the chandelier light. Beatriz took off the ring carefully, like untying a knot in a memory. She placed it into a small box and slid the box into a pocket of the dress she had brought back to the hotel. She lay awake with the weight of exposure that comes from being seen at your worst and in front of too many people. At 2 a.m. her phone buzzed. A message from Raphael pinged with a different light than the earlier one. She stared at it until the letters blurred. "I'm sorry. Can we talk?" it read. She didn't answer. She stared at the ceiling, at the way the hotel light made everything look flatter and more honest. No, she thought. What thought is not the same as a sentence, and silence is sometimes the only honest answer. The next morning's sunlight had the look of someone forcing herself to be brought back to ordinary time. The press thrummed outside the hotel like distant insects. She took a shower and dressed in clothes that were not wedding clothes, plain, sensible suits that would not be news. She called in for the day at work in a voice that felt like a public statement. Rodrigo texted her a short list of instructions. Avoid speculation. Don't speak to the press. Maintain a private social media presence. Meet him at noon at the headquarters. The last line was not a question. It was a summons. Pulling herself together to walk into the glass tower where she had worked for 3 years was like stepping back into an old novel you had once loved. The lobby recognized her. The security guard offered the same small nod. The receptionists smiled with a fragile, practiced hospitality. But the building had been changed into a diorama of rumor. Screens in the cafe looped the footage from the night before. Coffee cups in the hands of regulars steamed like tiny, warm announcements of the day. At the elevator, someone edged away. In the 5th-floor corridor, a junior analyst stopped mid-sentence when she appeared and watched with the kind of interest you save for collisions. Emails arrived in her inbox like a drumbeat, and message from human resources offering support and an awkward legal-sounding note emphasizing company policy. An invitation to a quiet debrief with the communications team, a calendar invite for 12 that simply read, Rodrigo, brief. The subject line of the company-wide internal newsletter had been altered to present the weekend as a situation that leadership would address. The worst part of being a public spectacle is not the cameras, but the way faces shift. People who had once been colleagues now regarded her with a new kind of curiosity that was not supportive. The receptionist who used to ask about her weekend now asked in a voice that tried too hard to sound normal, "Are you okay, Ms. Almeida?" which translated roughly to, "Are you now the woman who will be a footnote in our stories?" Rodrigo's office was glass and soundproof. Inside, he kept his things in a minimal, almost sculptural arrangement. He sat behind his desk the way an island might hold back stormwater, everything deliberate and organized. He was not a man of excess in visibility. Rather, his power came from a focus that made the rest of the room seem to belong to it. When she entered, he gestured to a chair. She sat because that's the civilized protocol. He unfolded a stack of papers, legalese, press drafts, and an itinerary for public appearances. He spoke in a voice that had little texture. "We need rules," Rodrigo said. "We need a line between what's performative and what's private, because right now there's no line." Beatriz wanted to test him, ask whether he truly understood how precarious the position of a woman is in a story like this, but she didn't. Instead, she listened as he laid out a practical map. They would present as a couple in public spaces for the next few weeks to shape the narrative. He would speak to their communications team to create a consistent line. She would not be required to attend events that compromised her dignity. And crucially, he said this last as if it required calibration, there would be an agreed boundary in the office. Professionalism would be maintained. "Are you doing this because it's easier for you too?" she asked, the question sharp but careful. He did not blink. "There's no ease in this," he said. "There's management." Which was, in its way, both true and cold. He was managing reputations, including his own. He had the instinct not to let a thing like a viral spectacle bleed into the brand he had built. That instinct landed him in the pew and in the photos. But it did not necessarily mean he was immune to whatever nuance there might be to Beatriz's pain. He slid a thin black card across the desk, the kind with corporate contact numbers and his personal assistance line. "Limit the public-facing interactions unless absolutely necessary," he said. "Allow me to field the press. In the office, if anyone makes this personal, you come to me. If you need time away, take it." She nodded. "And if I don't want to pretend anymore?" He said quietly. That answer, again, was practical. It left the concept of choice intact, but it also reminded her that she was under the same roof as the very man who both shielded and controlled the perimeter of that choice. The days that followed were a study in choreography. Photographers circled and retreated like tide lines. An op-ed ran speculating on whether a union with a powerful business leader was a true alliance or a PR stopgap. The comments under that piece were bone raw. Strangers felt permission to weigh in on her worth. Her mother texted advice and scripture. Her sisters sent memes that made her laugh because laughter is a brittle, honest thing. At work, lunchtime conversations warped into analyses of how the company would be perceived if it allowed such a relationship to stand. Rumors about favoritism sprouted like weeds. Rodrigo kept his distance in public and near her in private.
He introduced her to board members at a dinner as Beatriz Almeida, who works closely on our urban development projects, rather than my wife, when the context demanded professional clarity. At a charity gala where they were photographed on a red carpet, he held the small of her back while they walked, and then kept his tone intentional and formal when they spoke to the organizers. It was a balancing act he performed well because he had always performed well. There were moments, though, that the mask slipped. On a Tuesday afternoon, a junior client called the office to renegotiate terms and began interrupting with a brusqueness that felt designed to assert power. Rodrigo stepped into the call and, in one falling sentence, redirected the disrespect. He did it not with grand gestures, but with a single, almost small, recalibration of language that restored order. Afterwards, he looked at Beatriz with a softness that was almost private. "You don't have to take that," he said. "I didn't," she replied. He smiled then, briefly, and the smile was not for public consumption. It was private and warm and slightly absurd on the corner of a mouth trained for restraint. It suggested that under the armor there might be a place that recognized the unfairness of the world he lived in, and maybe even the cruelty of it. She was not naive, though. A wall between them had been erected as quickly as the headlines had been written. It was made of policy and propriety, of the knowledge that he was 14 titles and a continent of reputation away from her. When they were alone meaning they could whisper without spin, there were conversations about a plan, about the legalities they would need to consider. There were no promises about love. There were only practicalities. "Legally, we should find out what this means," she said one evening over coffee in the company's small, quiet kitchen. The kettle clicked its slow domestic song. "We will," he answered. "I have people." The phrase, "I have people," is the language of power. It makes invisible work visible. It promises the abrupt erasure of inconvenience. She heard it and felt both gratitude and the metallic aftertaste of being owned by someone else's solutions. Then, like a small, unexpected stone thrown into a pond, a message appeared on her phone during a late-night spreadsheet emergency. It was Raphael. This time, the content carried different punctuation. "We need to talk," it read. "Please, just talk. I messed up." The immediacy of his need struck a chord inside her that had nothing to do with the marriage they'd been preparing for, and everything to do with the years she had invested in an imagined future. Raphael had been a safe bet at times, funny, familiar, promising in a way that did not frighten her. He had been the comfortable geography of a life she thought she wanted. But safety is not the same as love, and his absence at the altar had remapped her body with truth.
She placed her hand over the phone like a seal. She could imagine the conversation 100 ways, apologetic, pleading, indifferent. The thing that narrowed her chest was not the content of his messages, but the idea that his return into her life would demand a kind of forgiveness that might not belong to her to grant. A new headline popped up on the cafe screen downstairs. "Powerful CEO steps in at wedding scandal. Is it romance or strategy?" The caption under it framed the story in a way that suggested ownership rather than rescue. Beatriz felt the shape of something new forming around her, one that had been pressed there by a man in a suit and 1,000 flashing lenses. It was not fully a life, not yet a narrative with chapters. It was a liminal space where choice and pressure rubbed against each other until heat was generated. That afternoon, she opened an internal memo that bore the company's logo. It was titled simply, "Public Relations, Narrative Control." Her eyes scanned the paragraphs. The first line read,
To mitigate reputational risk associated with last weekend's events, leadership requests that all external communications regarding the situation be deferred to corporate counsel and the communications office. Underneath, in a different font, someone had added a sentence, "Maintain dignity, protect privacy." She looked up from the paper and found Rodrigo standing in the doorway, evidently having entered without a knock. He folded his hands in front of him in a casual manner that felt deliberate. "You read it?" he asked. "I did," she replied. "We will manage it the way we manage anything that threatens the company, surgically, quietly, and with as little collateral damage as possible," he said. "And your collateral, where does that leave me?" He paused then, and the pause was not a failure, but a measuring of something. "You leave it on the table," he said, "and if you don't want what's on the table, you tell me. We renegotiate." The phrase felt like a contract and a warning. She wanted to ask whether he would be bound by the same rules if it was his dignity on the chopping block. But words like that felt like splinters, necessary and painful. When she left his office, a thread of newness was stitching itself into her days. A busy schedule of charity events, PR-friendly dinners, coffee shop photo ops with intentionally casual smiles. At each turn, Beatriz performed a skill she had not been trained in, how to make someone believe you were fine when you were not. She learned to angle her face so that it read vulnerability without pity, resolute without hardness. And in the small pockets between appearances, she walked alone, because solitude had become an interior requirement. She navigated her grief the way you navigate a city you do not trust. Watch every corner, count your steps, carry a small light. Late one evening, the company intranet lit up with an internal poll someone had set up, anonymous and cruel. "Do you think Miss
Almeida should stay in her role?" Comments flooded, blunt, some supportive, some predatory. The anonymity the internet provided was a landscape that encouraged fervor more than empathy. She wished she could rip it all down and set it on fire, but to do so would be to engage on terrain she could not afford to occupy. She had a meeting the next morning with HR. She rehearsed what she would say and what she would refuse to say. She navigated questions that tried to fold her into neat categories, professional or personal, victim or actor of her own salvation. She refused those categories. They were too small for the life that was expanding and contracting behind her ribs. That night, as she sat in the small borrowed suite that had become a sanctuary of sorts, her phone buzzed again. This time the notification was from an unknown number. A video had been posted, shot from the back of the church and uploaded to one of the city's tabloids. In it, the organ played as if nothing had happened, and in the margins of the frame, Rodrigo's figure moved like a stagehand, positioning the narrative. The comments were swift, slicing into the hours like a winter wind. She turned off the phone and pressed it face down on the nightstand. She watched the city lights through the window and tried to feel something that was not raw. She thought about how stories change you, how a single snapshot can remap your life in front of you if you let it. At 2 a.m, another message lit the screen, from Rodrigo. Not a text, but a short line, almost clinical, with no room for warmth. "Be here at 9. We need to discuss tonight's gala and media strategy." She read it and placed her thumb slowly over the message. A part of her wanted to say no. Another part of her imagined a life where someone took responsibility for the chaos he'd entered. Outside, the city hummed its indifferent lullaby. Inside, the suite smelled faintly of perfume and old lavender. She felt encased within decisions not entirely her own. She breathed, and for a moment allowed the thought that this was temporary, that the borrowed coat would be returned, that the ring would be dismissed as prop, that Raphael would not return, or if he did, he would be small and diminished by the choices he made. Her phone buzzed one last time before sleep swallowed her,
a message from an unknown number that read, "Blunt and official. There's a reporter on the line. They want exclusives." Beatriz turned the phone over, decided not to answer, and let the darkness come, knowing that morning would map the next line in a story she had not chosen to write, and that every choice she made would be watched.
The cameras had not stopped. The story continued, breathless and iterative, refitted into new headlines by noon. She had learned to carry the day like a parcel, steady hands, small answers, no more than necessary. There was a single short CTA she allowed herself because the world required it in exchange for its attention. "If this is gripping you," he thought she would say. No, she thought instead, "If this is something you care about, linger a moment and subscribe." It felt ridiculous and practical all at once, like remembering to breathe. Rodrigo's management was precise. He kept a thin map of the week on his desk and placed her appointments on it in green and red, public engagements in green, private spaces protected in red. The map read like a promise written in business ink, safe zones and contact points. She had agency inside it only because he had consented to draw her a boundary, and that fact settled into her like a bruise she could not ignore. They agreed on rules because agreements make the uncertain legible. No public displays that could be misconstrued. If anyone at the office started a rumor, she would come to him. He would deal with it. If any press called, only the corporate counsel would respond. They would present as a unit in the most sensible way possible, composed, purposeful, and unromantic. They both knew the danger. They also both recognized the necessity. Still, rules do not erase the small, dangerous friction of proximity. In the office, corridors that once felt private were threaded with the possibility of gossip. People shifted conversations to quieter rooms. Jokes that had been ally-making became eyes down. Invitations ceased to come. Promotions were spoken of more quietly in the space where risk is measured before words. Beatriz found herself metabolizing micro-judgments into a steady lightness she called focus. There were, despite the choreography, moments that punctured the theater. Like the afternoon when a junior analyst tried to corner her at the coffee machine and asked with brutal curiosity whether she planned to stay at the company. Beatriz could have answered with the practiced deflection she had rehearsed. Instead, she said plainly, "I work here. I am not a story for your entertainment." The analyst blinked, startled into shame. The rest of the room breathed differently afterward. Small acts of steadiness ripple. Outside work, the world expected performance. A charity gala came up, a carefully chosen event where the photographers would be amenable to a polite couple photo. Rodrigo had insisted they attend together. The optics were tidy. Beatriz spent the morning in a dress that felt like an armor left at the dry cleaner for decades, and when she emerged, he adjusted the hem with the clinical care of a man removing an inconvenience. He walked at her side, not his arm possessive, but near, a steady presence. At the gala, Rodrigo introduced her as a colleague, which was the careful truth in that room. But when they were asked to speak on a stage about a civic initiative, his demeanor softened in the way he reserved for precise things. He spoke about the city's public spaces, and when he turned to her, it was to invite her expertise. The microphone broadened her voice for the room. People listened. That, more than the red carpet, felt like a reclamation. The public narrative, however, did not entirely bow to their plan. Online, some commenters created speculative novels about why a CEO would step into a wedding. Others complained on principle that powerful men act only for spectacle. A few started subtler conversations about what it means to defend someone in a public moment, whether bravery and strategy might wear the same face. It was messy and sometimes compassionate. Beatriz read the kinder threads and folded them into a private list. The meaner ones she discarded like paper with sharp edges.
In private, Rodrigo's care had a geometry of restraint and reach. He did not overstep the boundaries they had negotiated at the office, but his gestures, an umbrella held over her head during a sudden rain, a quiet text asking if she'd eaten, were practical tenderness. She noticed them the way one notices a small plant thriving in a window, necessary and living, deserving attention. Her friendships became sacred in a new way. Julia moved into the role of an anchor, fierce when the world suggested pity, pragmatic when it offered solutions. One night, after an event where Beatriz had been photographed more than she had liked, Julia invited her to a small dinner at her apartment. It was meant to be a sanctuary. The evening started with quiet food and wine, and the kind of talk that stitches viability into a life. Halfway through, Julia's younger sister burst into the kitchen, breathless and on the ragged edge of tears. There had been a problem at home, an argument that had blown into the need for immediate help. Julia's face changed from convivial to concerned in a matter of heartbeats. Without speaking, she looked at Beatriz as if to ask, "Can you stay a moment?" Beatriz did not hesitate. They drove across town in silence. The sisters' apartment was a small, bright mess of a city life. Arguments lingered like wet clothes. Beatriz, who had been trained in the diplomacy of budgets and meetings, found herself in a new role: listener, mediator, presence. She stayed until the crisis calmed, making tea and telling half-jokes and reminding a family of the quiet kindnesses that can diffuse an argument. When the sister finally sobbed into a pillow and drifted into sleep, the three women sat on the kitchen floor among the cups and wrappers. "You saved me tonight," Julia said, voice small. "You didn't have to." "I wasn't thinking of myself." The sentence was true. It did not make her stronger, it made her necessary, and the feeling of being needed was complicated and good.
Rodrigo arrived to pick her up late, the city lights a smear of gold across the windshield. He held her hand for a moment as if to relay a small fact. "You are safe to return." The gesture was private and unadvertised. When they stepped out of the car and onto the dark sidewalk, his fingers lingered at the small of her back as he guided her to the building lobby. Those tiny contacts were building a grammar between them, syllables that together formed phrases of comfort. It was in that intimacy of the ordinary, kitchen lights and spilled tea, a hallway smelling faintly of lemon cleaner, that the first irrevocable fault line shifted. They were in Julia's apartment a few nights later, the kind of gathering that begins as distraction and becomes a little fierce with laughter. The band on the radio played an old song that Beatriz loved. She stood in the kitchen making sandwiches and laughed because the world had not yet normalized the fact that her wedding had been a spectacle. Rodrigo, who had been tidying, came up behind her and reached for a plate. Their hands brushed over the ceramic as if by accident. For a moment they were both still, the kind of still that has a humming sound to it, the body's quick little thought. He did not let go immediately. She turned, and he looked at her differently, not the executive who solved problems, but a man who held a private memory close. "Do you want to get out of here for a minute?" he asked, voice low. She hesitated, not because she feared the proposition, but because she wanted to gauge the terms. "Where would we go?" He smiled, that small, rare smile that had appeared in the office and then vanished. "For a walk," he said. "Just the two of us." They left without fanfare and walked the city streets until they found the quiet strip where a late-night bakery smelled of butter and yeast. They sat at a small table by the window, watching people pass. Conversation began with small things about traffic and bread, but grew on its own like ivy, the kind of talk that traces your edges. He told her about his childhood apartment, a terse two-bedroom his father had left him in a part of the city that smelled of diesel and orange blossoms, about a mother who'd taught him to iron shirts and never to show the messy inside of things. He spoke in fragments, as if revealing history in pieces made it safer both to tell and to receive.
She, in turn, told him about a summer she had spent on a friend's boat as a kid, learning how to hold rope and steer in a wind that demanded attention. The stories were small. They were not declarations. In the soft thick of that place between strangers and companions, the moment shifted. When they left the bakery, the night air felt like permission. Back at Julia's, the apartment was asleep. The radio had stopped. In the kitchen, near a sink full of dishes, Rodrigo reached for her hand. The touch was deliberate now, not the index of protocol. He looked at her in a way that shed the business suit of his public persona. There was tenderness in his eyes that belonged to a private man. They moved closer, as if answering an old but quiet summons. The kiss that followed was not an announcement. It began soft, testing, a question between two curved bodies in a small domestic space. It deepened because both of them chose it. No power was exerted, no coercion existed. It was mutual, the kind of consent that arrives in the pause when both people decide to continue. They parted with a private laugh at a breathless, half-ashamed lightness. The kitchen light hummed. The rest of the apartment slept. The kiss did something in Beatriz like a small earthquake. It altered the internal map. She liked the man who could be both careful and close. It terrified her that she might like him more than she wanted to admit. After that night, their relationship moved in new trajectories. Sensual not merely because physical contact increased, but because the intimacy of private talk became an engine. They were still careful in public, but private moments multiplied. A coffee in the company kitchen that stretched longer than necessary. A shared sandwich in the stairwell where the building's noise muffled them. A pair of hands brushing in a doorway. Each touch was a negotiation. Each pause was an agreement. Legal questions, which had been background static, became urgent. An envelope arrived one Tuesday like a cold gust. The formal papers for divorce. It was an official-looking packet, crisp and bureaucratic, with the company's legal counsel copied, and with a polite form that required a signature. The packet read like an ultimatum. Formally end this tie or leave the legal status to the mechanics of reputation. They sat across from each other at his minimalist kitchen table that evening, the papers between them, the light from the window drawing the pages into relief. Rodrigo had ordered takeout. He did not pick at his food. He pushed it aside and focused on the stack of documents. "Your options are not just legal," he said. "They're social. Officially ending this will keep the headline going for a bit. People love a separation tale. Keeping the marriage, even on paper, keeps the story coherent. An annulment could be messy and would involve arguments about intent and time. A divorce has its own implications for the next phase." Beatriz read the papers carefully. She traced the formal language with a finger. Juridical terms were not new to her. She had seen enough corporate memos to know how they could rearrange reality. But this was her life being folded into legalese. The choice felt like choosing the shape of her future. "Why would you want me to sign?" she asked. The question sounded small, but it was a probe for motive. Rodrigo looked at her as if deciding how much to reveal. He had been careful not to romanticize his actions in front of her. He said, "Because if we divorce, the story changes. The narrative becomes, she moved on. The details crumble into column inches. If we keep things as they are, the immediate spectacle quiets down because the public has a timeline. The problem is, maintaining that status quo binds you in a way that might not be yours to own." They debated in practicalities, lawyers, timescales, public relations. He admitted he had already spoken to his counsel about possible routes. She listened, not without skepticism. His "I have people" was a double-edged phrase. It solved dilemmas, but reminded her how much of her life had been reshaped by someone else's capacity to call on resources. She pushed back. "I will not be the armature for your public narrative," she said. "If I sign, I need more than promises.
I need terms that protect me, a clause that says no public spin without my consent, a transition role so my career isn't vaporized, and, she added, I need the truth about why you sat in that pew. He leaned back, fingers interlaced. The question about why was a keyhole he had carefully guarded. He told her, haltingly, of nights he'd spent watching a man who'd had to learn to hide. He told her about a childhood where appearances were survival, where power was a shield and vulnerability a liability. He said he had watched her that day and felt something like a human imperative to act, an impulse that was not only to protect the company, but to protect a person in pain. I couldn't have you shredded in front of the city, he said. I couldn't let that be the shape of the rest of your life when it could be something else. There was no grand confession of love in that sentence. There was instead something like stewardship, the kind that can be misread and the kind that can be self-fulfilling. Beatriz recognized that stewardship could be a form of care or a form of control, depending on who held the map. They negotiated terms late into the night. He agreed to insert protections into any declaration, clear language that any public statements required mutual consent, financial guarantees in case of reputational damage, a commitment that he would introduce her professionally and advocate for her projects publicly as her colleague and his equal. She insisted on time, no immediate legal erasure. They would delay signing anything substantial for 3 months while they spoke to counsel and clarified boundaries. It felt like a compromise where neither power nor vulnerability wholly surrendered. Then Raphael returned, like a wind that rustles the room. He arrived in town with a string of late apologies, interviews asking for forgiveness, and a small, desperate public attempt to explain his absence. He sought Beatriz directly, not via a press statement, but with messages that grew in frequency and tone. He asked for a meeting. Beatriz arranged to meet him in a small cafe, unadorned and public, because private conversations with him felt dangerous. When he arrived, he looked apologetic and oddly ashamed, the way people who have recently learned the stakes of their actions do. He asked for forgiveness, for a second chance. He spoke with practiced regret, words circling the edges of sincerity. She listened with a patience that came from a place of felt distances. It was not that she had wanted him to fail, she had wanted their wedding to be the beginning of what she'd planned, but his flight had been a clean failure, a choice that unraveled 1,000 small things. She told him she could not be the person who existed to make him comfortable again. She said she needed time and space. He pressed and he begged, and she answered with a clarity that surprised him. She could not be a safe harbor for someone who had chosen to abandon her when the stakes were public. When she told Rodrigo the outcome, he listened with a face that did not betray relief. He seemed almost pained by the fact that her refusal meant she was closing a door on a past that had been easy but false. "Are you choosing me?" he asked one evening, as if seeking permission or confirmation of some obscure ritual. She looked at him. There was a steady lucidity in her eyes now, a clarity he had witnessed in boardrooms when she made decisions about budgets and relationships with partners. "I am choosing myself," she said. "If you are part of that, it is because you are here honestly." The months that followed were neither swift nor simple. The world made assumptions anyway, and they learned to navigate the slings and arrows with a sort of pragmatic tenderness. They held public events that were designed to shift the narrative from scandal to contribution. A park cleanup, a small urban garden inauguration where Beatriz spoke about community and equity, a civic lecture that Rodrigo sponsored, during which he quietly elevated her role. She was not a prop in those moments. She was visible in her expertise. In private, their relationship deepened along too many small axes to catalog. Rodrigo revealed over long nights a string of small vulnerabilities, an old photograph of a boy on a bike with a missing tooth, a story about a father who left when money became more interesting than family.
He described his own fear of being seen not as a leader, but as a flawed man. Beatriz, in turn, admitted to fears she had not let herself name: fear of being defined only by a moment of humiliation, fear of losing autonomy in the shadow of a powerful partner. They did not solve these fears with a kiss or a promise. They contained them with talk, with lists, with small, repeated acts of repair. There were risks, the rumor mill churned regardless, an intern's offhand remark that got retweeted, a late-night op-ed speculating about favoritism that reached into the HR inboxes. Rodrigo fielded these with an economy of detail. When a board member whispered about optics, he reminded them of strategy, investing in talented leaders, protecting staff from public cruelty. He used his influence to protect her career in ways she did not always see until the results appeared: her name on a high-profile project that others had overlooked, the invitation to co-lead a task force on urban renewal. Promotion followed not as a gift, but as recognition of a long-stewarded competence. One afternoon, during a site visit to a redevelopment project, Rodrigo pulled her aside. They had been walking the dusty, open lot, the sun bright, and a wind like something cleaning the city of debris. He stopped, took her hand, and led her to a low stone bench where they sat with the earth between their knees. "Do you remember when we first met?" he asked. She laughed at the absurdity of the question. There was a memory of meeting in the elevator, of formal introductions, of emails. "You were impeccable." "So were you," he said, composed. "I thought then, this is someone who manages herself. I respected that. But I didn't see you the way I saw people I could move around on a chessboard." There was a softness in his voice that surprised her. "What changed?" she asked. He was honest. "You did. You were the one who asked insistently and kept asking. You'd remind me about small injustices at an early meeting. You'd ask why the community's voice mattered. Slowly, I began to see the person who was in those questions. And when I saw that open wound last weekend, what was happening, I felt like if I didn't act, I would have to live with that choice." It was a confession not of adoration, but of a moral calculus that had become personal. It revealed how he measured his world, by outcomes and by an unexpected tenderness that recalibrated his decisions. The legal papers remained unsigned. The 3-month window they had negotiated gave them space to breathe. Within that space, a new conversation emerged. What would it mean to marry, really, now that the spectacle had turned inward and the world had a hunger for definitions? Beatriz felt cautious about headings. She had learned that public titles change the way people treat you. She had also learned that if a relationship was to be soul true, it needed an internal logic that did not belong to headlines. Rodrigo surprised her one winter evening with an envelope and a nervousness she had not seen before. He handed it to her with the gentleness of someone who had rehearsed the act in private and knew the stakes of words. Inside was a small Polaroid, an old picture of him in a faded suit, a child with a Band-Aid on his knee, and a note he had written by hand. "To Beatriz," it said, "I walked into that church to stop a story. I stayed because I wanted to learn how to be in the small rooms. I do not expect you to sign anything because I asked. I know better now.
If you are willing, I would like to ask you, properly, if you would marry me, not because of spectacle or shame, but because I want to choose you, openly and without the pressure of optics." The proposal did not come wrapped in roses or a public performance. It came in a private stationer's envelope, because he knew the only authentic vows are the ones heard in the small hours. Beatriz read the words and felt a slow clarity. She answered honestly. She told him she needed time to decide, not because she doubted him now, but because she needed to ensure her choice was fully hers. She wanted no shadow of coercion, no residual leverage of protection to become a chain. He agreed. They would not rush the decision. They would continue to live transparently and to build trust. The months moved from negotiation to maturity. They addressed company policies openly.
Rodrigo instituted clearer rules about workplace relationships and created a transparent path to ensure that Beatrice's promotion was evaluated by a neutral committee. He insisted on an external review for her role to remove any suspicion of favoritism. She proposed a mentoring program for women at the company, a plan he funded and they launched together, not as a PR stunt, but as an institutional correction. When the call came from the HR director telling her she'd been recommended for a formal promotion, an elevation to lead the urban development team, Beatriz felt a complex triumph. It was recognition that had been won through competence and negotiation rather than the currency of headlines. She accepted carefully, and then called her father. He cried when she told him, a sound of release that was both paternal pride and the survivor's relief. Raphael had one more attempt. He returned to the city, this time with a more visible sorrow. A tabloid offered to run a redemption profile if he would consent to a sit-down. He reached out to Beatriz, public plea meeting private resolve. She did not meet him. She understood he was part of her past, but not her future. When he later apologized publicly, she declined to issue any official statement. She let the silence be a boundary in itself. The turning point came not with a courtroom drama, nor with a grand declaration, but with a small domestic miracle, the first morning they cooked together. It was a Saturday, sunlight slanting across their apartment's kitchen. They moved like old partners, Rodrigo chopping vegetables with surprising care, Beatriz stirring sauce and stealing the occasional glance at him. It was simple, it was ordinary, it was private. After breakfast, Rodrigo took her hand and led her to the balcony, where city noise seemed to lower into the distance. He felt nervous again, but this time it was a different flutter, less the fear of image, more the fear of honesty. "Will you marry me?" he asked, with the same simplicity as a ledger entry, but with something much heavier behind it.
Beatriz looked at him, at the man who had sat in a pew and stepped into a spectacle and then walked painstakingly back toward truth. She thought of the months they'd spent negotiating boundaries and the ways in which he had chosen to protect her career and ask for no control. She thought of the small acts of tenderness and the nights they had both admitted things that left them raw. She said yes, not because it would fix everything, but because she could envision a future with him where her choice mattered, where publicity and power would be checked by agreed terms, where love was built in small, mutual acts rather than in rescue narratives. They decided to marry properly this time, intentionally, privately, with careful planning that respected their past. They told the company in a measured way. The official statement they released was modest and honest. Two colleagues who had been part of a public event had decided to build a life together. They emphasized partnerships, professional and personal, and reiterated the institutional safeguards Rodrigo had enacted. The board agreed with measured applause. The press did their predictable unpacking of long timelines and sugar-sweet interviews, but the worst of the speculative cruelty had blunted over time. People grew bored. People were complicated. On their wedding day, this one chosen on their terms and in a small registry office rather than a cathedral, few guests attended. It was not an erasure of the old spectacle, but a reclamation of the intimate. Julia stood by as matron of honor. His closest friends, those who had learned to love him for the man beyond the suits, were there. Beatriz's father walked her down a modest city hall hallway, his hands steady. The official read the short, legal words. They exchanged vows that were not for an audience, but for each other. Simple, honest sentences that acknowledged mistakes and named commitments. Afterwards, they did something quiet. They went to the small bakery where they'd first held hands and bought 2 slices of cake, ate them on a bench under the same sodium lights that had once felt harsh and now felt like a halo. They did not stage photos for tabloids.
A few photographs were taken by friends and kept as proof of a private joy. At work, Rodrigo promoted Beatriz publicly for the projects she had led, and it was a move unrelated to pity or optics. It was a professional recognition. The board commissioned an independent review of the company's internal policies to make sure no one else was put in a position of vulnerability. The mentorship program she had launched expanded and began to effect change. They lived cautiously into their marriage. There were conversations about power, about the fact that he could still call on resources she could not, about the need for clear, periodic renegotiation of boundaries.
They continued therapy, both individual and as a couple, not because they were broken, but because they were attentive to systems that had formed their habits. Power, they understood, is a thing to be named and distributed. There were small, tender confessions. Rodrigo revealed that he'd admired her from afar before the wedding, that in meetings he had noticed how she commanded respect without loudness, and that his decision to stand in at the altar had been both an attempt to protect the company and the first time he'd allowed himself to be moved by compassion without calculation. Beatriz admitted that she had allowed herself to accept help that she'd negotiated for, and that the negotiation itself had been her claim to autonomy. Years later, friends would say how improbable their match had seemed at first glance. They would narrate the path from humiliation to dignity, from spectacle to small domesticity. But for Beatriz and Rodrigo, the story would always be neither wholly grand nor simple. It was messy, negotiated, and honest. They learned that dignity can be reclaimed only through 1,000 small decisions, that loving someone who could have power over you requires not only trust, but also systems that limit the reach of that power. On an evening not unlike the one when he had first whispered the words that set them on this course, they sat on the couch in their apartment, a quilt over their knees, a rainstorm playing on the windows. Rodrigo handed her a small, plain box. Inside, a ring that was understated and lovely. He had not abandoned the gesture. He had refined it into something that belonged to the two of them. "I have always," he began, then stopped because words that belonged to epic declarations seemed too huge for the quiet room. "Say it anyway," she said, fingers finding his. "I have always respected you," he said finally. "But respect is different from love. I didn't understand the difference for a long time. Now I do. I want both. If you will have them, I will try to be worthy." She put the ring on. He kissed her, soft and deliberate, not to claim, but to promise. Outside, the city continued its indifferent hum, but inside there was an order that both of them had created. Rules, talk, slow intimacy, and a shared commitment to ensure that neither of their careers nor their dignity would be sacrificed to spectacle again. Years later, at a community inauguration she led, a young woman stopped Beatriz with an earnest face and asked quietly, "How did you do it? How did you survive being left at the altar?" Beatriz looked at the woman, then at Rodrigo waiting patiently a few steps away, and smiled with the tiredness and joy of someone who'd been through the storm and learned to read the weather. "You don't survive being left by pretending it didn't hurt. You survive by naming every small thing you need, by refusing to let someone else write your story, and by choosing, slowly, what love looks like for you."
The woman nodded the way people nod at truth. For Beatriz, the sentence wasn't a neat moral, it was a lived charter. The humiliation had been sharp and public, but it had become a hinge, not a tombstone. She had designed her dignity like a garment, tailored, argued over, and finally chosen. They continued to live with the knowledge that power can shelter or overshadow. They tended their lives like a garden, pruning when growth became tangled, watering when things were dry, getting their hands dirty. The city,
once an unforgiving audience, settled into background noise, and the small domestic miracles, the coffee ground ritual, the folded laundry, the quiet corrections spoken across a kitchen table became the everyday architecture of a love that had been hard won. And on quiet nights, when the world fell away and there was only their small shared light, Rodrigo would sometimes reach for her hand and whisper what he'd once whispered in a church in a crowd, "Pretend I'm your groom." But now the words were different, spoken in bed when they were both awake, eyes open, deciding together. They were no longer an order disguised as mercy, they were a request answered freely, a role taken not because anyone demanded it, but because two people chose each other again and again in truth.